Coming to you from beautiful Vancouver, Canada, this is Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here's your host, Mark Daly.
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. Today is Monday, March 21st, 2016, and this is episode number 2. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Mark Daly, and I'm very excited to say that the 2016 Formula One season is now officially underway. But before we get to that and a bunch of other F1 news, there is just a couple of items of housekeeping to get out of the way. The podcast is now officially available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn, and SoundCloud. So I submitted them all last week, and that was part of the reason of getting the first introductory episode out, was just to get the podcast feed and the RSS feed all up and running, so that's all taken care of. Now, if you get your podcast from anywhere else than what I already mentioned, then please let me know. You can email me at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com or even throw a tweet my way at scuderiaf1pod on Twitter. Okay, well, where do we even start to talk about last weekend's Australian Grand Prix? I thought it was a very enjoyable race. Qualifying was a little bit chaotic and disappointing and anticlimactic. But we'll talk about all of those in due course. First of all, I think we should talk about Fernando Alonso's crash round about lap 16 when he had a coming together at turn 3 with Haas F1's Esteban Gutierrez. Now, Alonso was in his slipstream and tried to get around Gutierrez on the outside, but what happened was when he pulled out, he actually clipped the left rear tire of Gutierrez, which sent him flying into the wall on the left-hand side of the track. And at that point, he had just had so much speed, he was literally out of control, and as the car entered the gravel trap, he was already turning from left to right, and he hit the gravel at right angles, and that's pretty much what sent his car into, basically launched it into the air. It was very frightening to watch because when you saw the replay on television, first of all, you saw was Gutierrez just in the middle of the gravel trap, and I actually thought when I saw that, well, that doesn't look all that bad. It looks like Esteban just cooked it a little bit and just went too deep and just ended up in the gravel trap. But as the camera panned a little bit further over, at the back of the gravel trap was the remains of another car, and I wasn't even sure whose car it was at first. And then you could see some of the sponsors and I think maybe one of the numbers. It was hardly recognizable as a McLaren, and when I saw that, my heart literally sank because it just was a complete wreck of a car, and I just had that feeling that whoever's car that was, it just wasn't good. And then lo and behold, a somewhat groggy-looking Fernando Alonso managed to pull himself out, which was absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. And fortunately, he was not any worse for the wear, and Esteban Gutierrez went over to make sure that he was okay. Both of them, of course, were taken to the medical facilities to go and get checked out. But in the later stages of the Grand Prix, you could see Fernando walking around in regular street clothes, looking no worse for the wear. So that was a really good thing to see, considering it could have been a lot worse. Now, Alonso said after the race, and I quote, "I am lucky to be here and thankful to be here. I am aware that today I spent some of the luck remaining in life. I want to thank McLaren and the FIA for the safety of this car. I am alive thanks to the job of the last 10 to 15 years in Formula One." End quote. So it was a real mess. Obviously, once they were taking care of the drivers, they had to take care of the big mess and all the destruction that was there. So the race was red flagged and stopped for about 20 minutes. After the race stewards did review the incident because it did look like at one point that maybe Gutierrez had pulled a little bit to the left, but ultimately they ruled that neither driver was at fault. And it was a very ambitious, and it was going to be very tough for Alonso to try and actually get around Gutierrez at that point on the track. And Alonso even said, quote, "If Gutierrez did move, it is because he tried to brake for his own racing line, and I need to anticipate that as well. But you are so focused on the slipstream, you only see a rear wing. You don't have any more vision of the track. I took the slipstream in quite an extreme way and tried to overtake at the last moment. Probably I braked a little too late. It's a combination of things. We are both okay, and that's the most important thing." End quote. And ultimately, that is the most important thing, that both Gutierrez and Fernando Alonso are both okay. So let's talk now about that thing that happened on Saturday, that qualifying thing. I'm not even really sure what to call it, because it was interesting, wasn't it? I know we talked about it last week in episode 1, just the new format that had been implemented for qualifying for 2016 and has now apparently been scrapped by a unanimous vote by the Formula One teams. Now, for those of you who didn't understand the format for the new qualifying, it was split up into 3 qualifying sessions as it was before. Q1 was a 15-minute session, and after 7 minutes, the slowest car would be removed, and then 1 car every 90 seconds thereafter. And then that's basically how it would work through Q2 and Q3 as well. And then basically what was supposed to happen is it would come down to the last 90 seconds, and it would basically be a shootout between the last 2 cars remaining to snag the pole position. So basically it didn't really work out that way. People were really upset because at times there were guys that weren't going to be able to make it out and on the track and get their time in within the 90-second elimination. And it really upset a lot of people. There was condemnation from Formula One drivers, teams, medias, and fans, and they literally scrapped it the very next day. And they're going back to the familiar format that we've had for many years, and that will be in place in Bahrain in 2 weeks. Now, Mercedes F1 boss Toto Wolff said, "We wanted to improve the show and we went in the wrong direction," and that the decision to scrap the new qualifying format shows that there still is common sense in Formula One. Now, the decision to change the qualifying was instigated by F1 commercial boss Bernie Ecclestone, and he had voted in favor of the now new system, but he was actually in favor of a more radical approach to qualifying that was intended to promote closer racing. After the qualifying was over, Ecclestone said, quote, "I watched it, but I have to say I wasn't enthusiastic about it from day one. It was pretty crap, but this is what we've got until we can change it." End quote. Never being the one to mince words, Bernie sure got it right, and fortunately, they are going to switch back. Now, Bernie also went on to say that reverting back to the old qualifying system will simply result in all Mercedes front rows. And it's hard to argue with that logic. We've seen over the last year or so how dominant Mercedes is, not just in the Grand Prix, but also during qualifying. And that's pretty much, I think, what's going to happen. So we'll see in 2 weeks in Bahrain if we're going to end up with all Mercedes front rows again. It didn't actually make a difference for this weekend because Hamilton and Rosberg were still P1 and P2 to start the race, so it didn't really change that. It was a real disaster. So the qualifying session did become more chaotic and confusing as it went on. Q1 and Q2 kind of made sort of sense at some points. It took me a couple of minutes to kind of really figure out what was going on. But when it came to Q3, all 10 drivers came back into the pits, and with more than 4 minutes left on the clock, nobody was out there. And it just looked really weird because at one point you saw Lewis Hamilton driving back into the pit lane, only to see Sebastian Vettel walking up the pit lane in jeans and a ball cap, and it just looked really weird because Seb looked like he didn't have a drop of sweat on him. So I'm disappointed that the new format didn't work out. I think that it did have some interesting possibilities, but in the end, it was just poorly implemented. And out of all the issues that Formula One has had in the recent years, qualifying was not one of the ones or one of the areas I thought that they really needed to address and change most urgently. But by the time it was all said and done, Lewis Hamilton was on pole and finally snagged that elusive 50th pole position, and then he was followed up by his teammate Nico Rosberg and then Sebastian Vettel and Kimi Räikkönen on the second row of the grid. Now, The race itself was quite exceptional. Before they even got going, there was a bit of an incident when Red Bull's Danny Kvyat his car just stalled on the grid before he could even make it to his grid spot. So they had to go around for an extra formation lap. Now, it was interesting to watch because all the cars in the top 10, except for the Force Indias, who started on soft tires, everyone else opted for the super softs. Now, Sebastian Vettel in the Ferrari made a great start from third on the grid. He took advantage of a slow start by Lewis Hamilton and managed to get between the two Mercedes and was the first car into turn one. Now, Nico Rosberg had a bit of a better start than his teammate, and he was able to get into the first corner before Lewis Hamilton, but he didn't really have the greatest line, being on the inside of the track and then also having to deal with Vettel racing by him. So he kind of went rather deep, and he actually nicked the end plate of Lewis's front wing on the right-hand side, and the two Mercedes cars fought for it just out of turn one, and it was Kimi Räikkönen from Ferrari that actually took advantage of that situation and snuck into second place. Now, out of the front runners, Hamilton at the start really lost out because he had to ease off a little bit, and he was passed by several other cars and eventually ended up in P6 behind Max Verstappen and Felipe Massa in the Williams, who was in P5. Now, by lap 16, Hamilton had decided that he needed to change his strategy and decided to come in for a pit stop and put on a new set of medium tires. So at that point, there was speculation that perhaps Lewis was going to try to go to the end of the race on one set of medium tires, which seemed fairly ambitious at the time, considering it was a 57-lap race and he still had 40-something laps to go. But it really didn't make too much of a difference because shortly thereafter, the race was red flagged, and that kind of reset a lot of people's strategies. But even before that, both Rosberg and Vettel pitted before that red flag. Nico came in on lap 13 from P3, and he changed and put on another set of soft tires. And then Sebastian Vettel, he came in a lap later from P1, and he switched to a set of super softs, and he had a very impressive 2.2 pit stop. And then both Rosberg and Vettel set fastest laps thereafter. Rosberg had a fast lap on lap 14, setting a 131.298, and then Vettel set a 130.757. But then it all happened. The race was stopped because of the big accident. Everybody came into the pits, and that changed a lot of things. But after the restart, both Mercedes went back out on medium tires, but Ferrari decided to stay with the super soft tires, which was an interesting strategy. And after the race, Ferrari boss Maurizio Arrivabene defended the tire strategy and said he believed Vettel would have beaten Rosberg if the race hadn't been stopped. Arrivabene told reporters after the race, quote, "I mean, on the pit wall, we were confident in all honesty. We were looking at the race and looking at the gap we were gaining, and at that time, our radio was to go with our strategy and keep going. I don't want to make any excuses. It's part of the race, and you have to accept it, and that's it." End quote. He was also asked about the decision not to switch to mediums before the restart, and Arrivabene said, quote, "We need to look at the data in the garage because every car has different consumption and degradation. To be certain if we were right or to be certain if we were wrong makes no sense now. We need to look at the data from the car." End quote. Rosberg also commented on the tire strategies, and he said, "From the red flag, we put on the right tires. We gambled with the mediums, and I don't think Ferrari made the right choice. I could go to the end, and I knew Sebastian had to stop again, so that gave me the win." End quote. Now, Hamilton also benefited from some good fortune after the race restart when both Toro Rossos pitted within a few laps of each other for new tires. And then Hamilton had a pretty clear track to catch up to Daniel Ricciardo, who was in P4, and he was about 7 seconds up the road. Now, Ferrari's strategy also came under scrutiny again in lap 35 when Vettel pitted again for tires. It was a slow stop, unfortunately, because the left tire didn't come off cleanly, and Vettel did rejoin the race in P5 just ahead of Felipe Massa, but he lost track position that extra couple of seconds, and it ultimately cost him a P2 finish. Finally, on lap 42, Hamilton passed Ricciardo in turn 1 to take P2, and that's where he stayed. Ricciardo actually pitted one more time for tires, and he impressively finished the race in P4, and he was really flying at one point, and he actually set the fastest lap of the race. Now, Sebastian Vettel did manage to eventually close the gap with Lewis Hamilton and got very close to him, but as he was starting to put Lewis under pressure, unfortunately, it was Seb who cracked and went a little bit too deep into turn 15 on the penultimate lap, and he went onto the grass, and then that was it. It just gave Lewis that little bit of extra distance between the two of them, and unless Hamilton made an uncharacteristic mistake, there was no question that he would just stay ahead of Vettel for that last lap. Rosberg won the 2016 Australian Grand Prix, and it was the same podium as last year, except the order was a little bit reversed. This year it was Rosberg winning, Hamilton in P2 and Vettel in P3. Last year it was Hamilton, Rosberg, and Vettel. And Rosberg won 31 years after his dad Keke won the 1985 Australian Grand Prix at Adelaide. Now, the big surprise that came out after the race was that Mercedes was actually very close to retiring Nico at one point because he was having problems with the brake. Now, Toto Wolff said, quote, "Managing tires and temperatures became a big challenge, with debris causing an overheating brake caliper that almost forced us to retire Nico at one stage. Thankfully, that was not the case, and he led Lewis home for a hard-fought 1-2, end quote. Now, Nico even chimed in on the incident saying, "They were about to retire me, so I was just managing it myself to the limit, but it was very close." Obviously, there wasn't anything too obvious on the outside of the car because Nico looked like he was not having any issues. So that was quite an interesting piece of news to learn after the race. And of course, there were many other talking points at the Australian Grand Prix this year. Number one, I think, has to go out to Haas F1 and Romain Grosjean for taking P6 and for the all-new American F1 team. Now, that is the first team since Toyota in 2002 to score points on their Formula One debut. So that was very impressive, and even more so because Grosjean started in P19 and he drove an excellent race, and the Haas looked very competitive. Of course, we don't really know how his teammate Gutierrez would have done ultimately because he was involved in that huge shunt with Fernando Alonso, but at least the one car looked very, very good. So where does that come down to? Was that just luck? Is that a benefit of the technical relationship that they have with Ferrari? Could be, but founder and chairman Gene Haas said, "There's a new F1 team on the block, and it's an American F1 team, so we're real proud of that. But these other teams are pretty dang good at what they do. I wouldn't sit here and say we're going to be in front of them all the time, but today was a good day." Now, another talking point was Max Verstappen and his expletive-laced rants on race radio. He did very well, Max did, to qualify in P5, but he was upset, first of all, at that botched pit stop, and then he was furious later on when his teammate Carlos Sainz blocked him later in the race. He actually ended up hitting his teammate at turn 15 after Sainz briefly locked up. Verstappen spun out and eventually finished the race in a rather disappointing P10. And that was, I think, what he called a nightmare of a race for him. Now, Max had quite an expletive-laced rant on the radio several times throughout the race, and at one point ordered the team to make Sainz slow down so he could pass him. But in my opinion, I don't think he needs to be ordered, or Sainz doesn't need to be ordered to slow down so Verstappen can pass him, because they're ultimately competing, they're racing for a position, and if Verstappen thinks that he's faster than him, then he should be able to pass him and get around him on the track. Now, Australia isn't one of those tracks where there are an abundance of places to overtake, but yeah, I think that if Verstappen thinks that he can do it, then he should just pass him on the track. But there's a real rivalry brewing between these two guys, and Martin Brundle, the ex-Formula One driver, believes that this Sainz-Verstappen rivalry could be even more intense than the rivalry that we've seen over the last couple of years between Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton. Now, another guy that was really impressive this past weekend was Jolyon Palmer in the Renault. He looks to be pretty good, didn't look out of place at all, and looks like he's suited to be in F1, at least what we saw at the Australian Grand Prix this past weekend. The Renault also looked pretty good, and it definitely looks like it has a lot of straight line speed. But one driver I think that was disappointing for me was Jenson Button in the McLaren, who ended up finishing P14, and he also ended up being lapped. Now, the fastest lap for Jenson was a 1:31.684, and compare that to Ricciardo's fastest lap, which was a 1:28.997, so he's 2.68 seconds behind him. Also compare that to Rosberg's fastest lap of a 1:30.557, so he was even 1.5 seconds slower than Rosberg. Eric Boulier from McLaren also said that everything that Fernando wanted, Fernando has got. So we'll look with interest to see what McLaren can do in a couple of weeks at Bahrain. So the final classification for the top 10 point scorers was Rosberg in P1, followed by Hamilton, Vettel, Ricciardo, Massa, Grosjean in P6 for Haas, Nico Hülkenberg, Valtteri Bottas, Carlos Sainz, and Max Verstappen. So after one race, the Drivers' Championship is as follows. Rosberg is first with 25 points, followed by Lewis Hamilton with 18, Sebastian Vettel with 15, Daniel Ricciardo with 12, and in fifth place is Felipe Massa with 10 points. Now, the Constructors' Championship already is looking a little bit one-sided, with Mercedes racking up 43 points for their 1-2 finish, followed by Ferrari with 15, Williams with 14, Red Bull with 12, and Haas with an impressive 8 points on their debut. Now, the fastest lap of the race was set by Daniel Ricciardo in the Red Bull, and he set a 1 minute 28.997 on lap 49. Now compare that to the fastest lap of last year. That was set by Lewis Hamilton, and that was a 1:30.945. Now if you compare that to the all-time lap record that was set by Michael Schumacher and a Ferrari back in 2004, that was a 1:24.125. So a huge difference in speed only 12 years later. Now, the next race is Bahrain, and that goes in 2 weeks from the 1st to 3rd of April. Now, Pirelli has already confirmed that for both Bahrain and China, the available tires will stay the same as they were this past weekend in Australia, and that's the super soft, softs, and medium compound tires. Now, last year, Hamilton won Bahrain with Raikkonen in P2 and Rosberg in P3. Raikkonen had the fastest lap there, and that was a 1 minute 36.311. And the lap record for that track at the Bahrain International Circuit is held by Pedro de la Rosa, who set a 1 minute 31.447, and that was back in 2005. So it will be interesting to see whether or not they can get any closer to those times, but definitely when you look at those fast times that were set about a dozen years ago, there still seems to be 4 or 5.5 seconds between the current lap times. So it'll be interesting to see if they can get any closer. Now, going into the race, it'll also be interesting to see whether Nico Rosberg can extend his run of 4 Grand Prix wins going back to Mexico of last year. And can Ferrari get it right again and beat Mercedes in Bahrain? These, of course, are all very, very interesting questions that we will be looking to with a lot of interest when the Formula One goes there in a couple of weeks. So we did get some questions in the mailbag for this week, and the one that really caught my attention was sent in by Aaron Campbell at AA Camp 81. And he wanted to know, if you had to pick a driver to start a new F1 team, who would you pick? Nico Rosberg or Lewis Hamilton, and why? And gosh, that is a really, really good question. Of course, how can you argue with not wanting to start a team with a 3-time world champion and one of the best drivers in the current generation in Lewis Hamilton? And there has been some suggestions in some quarters that now that Lewis Hamilton has won 3 world titles, that maybe perhaps he's not quite as motivated, or the drive isn't there to continue to perform at such a high level. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that Lewis is still a fantastic driver. He has plenty of speed. He showed again in qualifying that he is one classy driver. He showed in the race that even though he didn't have as much pace as his teammate, he was still there or thereabouts at the very end and managed to fend off Sebastian Vettel. But on the other hand, Nico Rosberg is also a very, very good Formula One driver. He's definitely been in a great run of form dating back to the end of last season. Of course, he won the last 3 races, and he's off to a good start this year. I don't know if you could really go wrong with either one of them. It just seems that when you get them both in the same team, that it seems to be oil and water at some times, and we've seen that relationship kind of blow up a couple times over the last couple of years. And it seems to be, at least at the moment, somewhat professional. I noticed that after the end of the race, as they were doing their cool down lap, that Nico, as he was waving to the fans, I saw Lewis pull up beside him, give him a thumbs up, and they did exchange, I guess, a bit of maybe it was an awkward hug. Maybe it wasn't a warm, cozy hug, but they did seem to get along a little bit after the race. And of course, for Mercedes, the ultimate goal is to win the world championship and the constructors and the drivers titles, of course, but getting a 1-2 is always what they seem to aim for. So they will definitely be happy with that. But I'd like to know what you guys think. If you were to start a brand new Formula One team, who would you pick? Nico Rosberg or Lewis Hamilton? Well, that's about all I've got for this episode of Scuderia F1. This is episode number 2, and I thank you all again for listening this week and for last week and bearing with me as I get the new format and get comfortable hosting a podcast on my own. I haven't really decided what I'm going to do between now and the Grand Prix in Bahrain in 2 weeks. Perhaps I'll do a short mini episode next week just with some F1 news that comes out between now and then, but definitely after the Bahrain Grand Prix on the 3rd of April, I'll be back with another full episode. And until then, if you want to get in touch with me, you can tweet me at Scuderia F1 Pod, or you can email me at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. I also set up a Facebook page, so that's facebook.com/Scuderia F1 Pod, so you can go and check that out and like it. Anyways, that's a wrap. Once again, my name is Mark Daly. Thank you all very much for listening, and I'll catch you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.